The autumn of 2001 in Oak Haven, Oregon, was crisp and painted in hues of amber and gold, a picturesque backdrop for a new semester at North Cascade University. But for two families, that vibrant season is remembered only in shades of gray. It was the year that the laughter of Sarah Jenkins and Chris Martinez faded into an unnerving silence. On the evening of October 12th, the two sophomores, inseparable friends and ambitious film students, walked out of their shared campus apartment to work on a class project and were never seen again. Their car, a beat-up 1992 station wagon, was found 3 days later, parked near the entrance of the old, defunct Blackwood Creek mine, its doors unlocked and a half-eaten bag of chips on the passenger seat. The air inside was still, holding a faint scent of pine and a cheap air freshener that dangled from the rearview mirror, a silent testament to a journey abruptly ended. Sarah Jenkins was the spark. Her family remembers her as a whirlwind of creative energy, her mind always buzzing with story ideas and camera angles. Her younger sister, Jessica, now a woman in her late 30s, clutches a faded photograph of a smiling, freckle-faced girl. She saw the world through a viewfinder. Jessica recounts, her voice thick with a grief that 22 years has not diluted. Everything was a story waiting to be told. She was fearless, maybe too fearless. She believed in the good in people, and that the truth, no matter how buried, was always worth digging for. Sarah's dorm room remained a shrine to her ambition, with movie posters tacked to the walls and textbooks lying open on her desk, as if she had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. Chris Martinez was the anchor to Sarah's kite, quiet, observant, and thoughtful. He was the steady hand behind the camera, the one who saw the subtle details Sarah's grand vision might overlook. His parents, Maria and Hector, speak of their only son in hushed tones, the pain still raw and palpable in their tidy suburban home. "He was a good boy, a gentle soul," says Hector, his gaze fixed on a framed photo of Chris holding his first camera. He and Sarah, they were two halves of a whole. She pulled him out of his shell, and he grounded her. When we lost him, the quiet in our house became a shout. It's a silence we've never gotten used to. The initial search was a frantic, desperate affair that swept through the dense forests surrounding the Blackwood Creek mine. For weeks, the hum of search helicopters blended with the crunch of leaves under the boots of volunteers and law enforcement. The air grew colder, and the vibrant autumn leaves turned to a brown, muddy carpet, swallowing any potential clues. They combed through every inch of the abandoned mining trails, their calls of Sarah, Chris, echoing through the skeletal trees, only to be answered by the whisper of the wind. The hope that had initially surged through the community began to wane, replaced by a creeping collective dread that settled over Oak Haven like a permanent fog dot. Detective David Miller, a rookie back in 2001, was one of the first officers on the scene when the car was reported. He remembers the unsettling normalcy of it all. The textbooks on the back seat, a crumpled receipt from a coffee shop dated the morning of their disappearance. It was like a scene frozen in time. Miller, now a seasoned captain, recalls, "You get a gut feeling in cases like this. There were no signs of a struggle, no immediate red flags, just absence. It was the most unsettling case I ever worked, the one that burrowed under my skin and stayed there. It felt like they had simply driven to the edge of the world and fallen off." The case quickly grew cold. Leads dried up, and persons of interest were interviewed and cleared. The media attention that had burned so brightly in the first few weeks eventually flickered and died, moving on to newer, more solvable tragedies. For the Jenkins and Martinez families, this was a second wave of agony. The realization that the world was forgetting while their own lives remained suspended in a state of perpetual uncertainty. They were left alone with their questions, their grief, and the two empty chairs at their dinner tables that would never be filled. Sarah and Chris became ghosts, their names etched onto a plaque on the university campus, a somber reminder of the two bright lights extinguished too soon. Their story turned into a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among new generations of students who dared to venture near the old mine. The mystery became a part of Oak Haven's identity, a dark undercurrent beneath the town's charming facade. The forest held its secrets tight, and the silence it kept was absolute, a heavy blanket over the truth. Life, for everyone else, moved on. Jessica Jenkins grew up, went to college herself, and started a family. But the shadow of her sister's absence stretched over every milestone. She would find herself dialing Sarah's old number, just to hear the disconnected tone. A painful ritual to remind herself it was real. The Martinez family retreated into a quiet life of faith, praying for a miracle, for some sign, for anything that might break the deafening silence that had consumed their world for over 2 decades. The case file, thick with old reports, witness statements, and dead-end leads, was eventually boxed up and moved to the cold case archives in the basement of the Oakhaven Police Department. It sat on a dusty shelf, a monument to failure and unanswered questions. Detective Miller would occasionally pull it out on quiet nights, flipping through the pages. The faces of Sarah and Chris staring back at him, their youthful optimism, stark contrast to the grim reality of their fate. The file was a weight he carried, a promise he had failed to keep. For 22 years, that was where the story ended, in a dusty box, in the quiet grief of 2 families, and in the deep, dark woods of Blackwood Creek. There was no closure, no final chapter, only a painful, unending ellipsis. But then, in the summer of 2023, in a place no one had ever thought to look, a key to the past was waiting. A forgotten box in a cluttered attic was about to be opened, and the silence that had reigned for more than 2 decades was about to be shattered by the flickering images of a lost college project. To understand where Sarah and Chris went, you have to understand what they were chasing. In the fall semester of 2001, they were enrolled in advanced documentary filmmaking, a competitive course taught by the enigmatic and demanding Professor Alistair Finch. The final assignment was daunting: produce a short 10-minute documentary on a piece of local history. While most students chose predictable topics like the town's founding or the university's architecture, Sarah, ever the ambitious storyteller, wanted something with more grit, more mystery. She wanted to tell the story of the Blackwood Creek mine and the ghost town that surrounded it. Chris was initially hesitant. The Blackwood Creek area had a dark reputation. In the 1930s, a mining accident had claimed the lives of a dozen men, and the place had been abandoned ever since. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning of unstable tunnels and a pervasive sense of sorrow that clung to the air. "It's just a bunch of rotten wood and bad memories out there," he had told Sarah, his concern evident in his voice. But Sarah was persuasive, her passion infectious. "That's the point, Chris," she had argued, her eyes alight. "It's not just rotten wood, it's a tombstone. We can give those men a voice. We can tell their story." Their project proposal, which Detective Miller would later read dozens of times, was titled Echoes in the Deep. It was a beautifully written document outlining their vision to blend historical research with atmospheric cinematography to capture the haunting legacy of the mine. Professor Finch had been immensely impressed, scrawling a plus concept, ambitious, "Be careful," in red ink across the top. This approval was the green light they needed, the validation that set them on their final, fateful path. They were determined to create something that would not only earn them a good grade, but would also make a mark. The weeks leading up to their disappearance were a flurry of activity. They spent hours in the university library's archives, poring over brittle, yellowed newspapers from the 1930s. They found the names of the men who had died, details of the collapse, and grainy photographs of the once thriving mining community. Sarah meticulously copied down every detail in her notebook, while Chris planned his shots, sketching storyboards of crumbling structures silhouetted against the setting sun. They were a perfect team, their individual talents merging seamlessly into a singular creative vision. Their friends from the film department remembered their obsession with the project. They talked about it constantly, their conversations filled with technical jargon about film grain, lighting, and sound design. They borrowed a high-quality Hi-8 camera from the university, a significant piece of equipment for the time, along with a professional boom microphone. They wanted their documentary to feel authentic, to have the raw, immersive quality of a real exploration. They were in their own little world, a former classmate recalled, totally consumed by that old mine. They made several preliminary trips to Blackwood Creek in the daylight hours. They filmed the decaying miners' cabins, the rusted-out equipment being slowly reclaimed by nature, and the gaping, ominous maw of the main tunnel entrance, which had been fenced off with a weathered danger keep-out sign. They interviewed a local historian, an elderly man who recounted the stories his grandfather had told him about the disaster and the subsequent exodus from the town. Every piece of footage, every interview, was a thread they were weaving into their narrative, but Sarah wanted more. The daytime footage was good, but she felt it lacked the eerie atmosphere she was trying to capture. She became convinced they needed to film at night. The ghosts only come out after dark. Chris, she had joked to a friend, a comment that would later take on a chilling significance. She wanted to capture the sounds of the forest at night, the way the moonlight filtered through the skeletal branches of the trees, the true, profound isolation of the place. It was a decision driven by artistic ambition, one that pushed them from the realm of cautious observers into active participants in the mine's dark history. On October 12, 2001, they planned their final shoot. They told their roommates they were heading out to Blackwood Creek to get some atmospheric night shots and would be back before midnight. Sarah had packed a thermos of coffee and a bag of snacks. Chris had meticulously cleaned the camera lenses and charged all the batteries. There was a palpable excitement between them, the thrill of nearing the finish line of a project they had poured their hearts into. They were confident, prepared, and completely unaware of the darkness that awaited them. Professor Finch was one of the last people to speak with them. Sarah had called him around 4 p.m. that afternoon to ask a technical question about recording audio in windy conditions. She sounded enthusiastic, professional. Finch would later tell police she was a star student. Truly. I told them both to be safe and that I looked forward to seeing the final cut. It was a mundane, forgettable conversation at the time, but it would become a crucial piece of the timeline. The final known communication before they vanished into the Oregon woods. Their disappearance left their project echoes in the deep unfinished. The footage they had already shot, stored on several high-8 tapes, was presumed to be with them when they went missing, lost to the same void that had claimed them. The police searched their apartment and found their notes, their storyboards, and their research, but the tapes, the actual product of their final weeks on Earth, were gone. Without them, there was no way to see what they had seen, no way to know what they might have captured in the moments. Before their story came to its abrupt and tragic end, the investigation into the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins and Chris Martinez began with a confusing and frustrating lack of evidence. Detective Miller and his team were faced with a pristine scene at the abandoned car. There were no signs of foul play, no blood, no shattered glass, no indication of a struggle. The keys were in the ignition, though the engine was cold. It was as if the occupants had simply parked, stepped out of the vehicle, and been swallowed whole by the surrounding forest. This absence of violence was, in itself, deeply unsettling, leaving investigators with a blank slate and 1,000 terrifying possibilities. The first 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity, dictated by the grim statistics of missing persons cases. The team established a command post near the mine entrance, coordinating the efforts of search and rescue teams, canine units, and volunteers. They interviewed friends, family, and faculty at North Cascade University, trying to build a picture of the students' lives and mental states. Everyone said the same thing. Sarah and Chris were happy, stable, and passionate about their film project. There was no indication of personal crisis, no reason for them to have run away. Professor Alistair Finch was interviewed extensively. He was, after all, the one who had assigned the project that led them to Blackwood Creek. Miller recalls Finch as being composed, articulate, but with a deep sadness in his eyes. He provided the police with the students' project proposal and all their graded work, hoping something might offer a clue. He was cooperative, Miller states, but also guarded. I got the sense he felt a heavy weight of responsibility. Here were his two brightest students, gone, while pursuing an idea he had praised. That's a heavy burden for anyone to carry. The focus soon shifted to the area around the mine itself. The fence blocking the main entrance had been partially pulled back, an opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. This immediately raised the most obvious and terrifying theory, that Sarah and Chris had ignored the warnings and entered the unstable mine. Engineers were brought in to assess the safety of the tunnels, but they deemed the primary shafts far too dangerous to conduct a thorough search. The risk of further collapse was too high, a fact that left a significant portion of the potential search area tragically inaccessible. Divers were sent into Blackwood Creek, a deep and murky body of water that snaked its way through the abandoned town site. The water was frigid, and visibility was near zero. They navigated through submerged debris and tangled roots, a dangerous and claustrophobic task. After several days of exhaustive searching, they found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no camera. Cliffman Creek, like the mine and the forest, held its secrets close. offering no solace to the desperate families waiting for any news at all. As days turned into weeks, the investigative team pursued every possible lead, no matter how tenuous. They looked into local transients, checked records of recently released prisoners, and followed up on a handful of tips from psychics and well-meaning citizens. One lead seemed promising for a time. A gas station attendant, a few towns over, thought he saw a couple matching their description late on the night they disappeared, but the station's security camera footage was too grainy for a positive identification, and the lead ultimately went cold. Just another dead end in a growing list of frustrations. The police paid close attention to the local folklore surrounding the mine. They interviewed old-timers in Oak Haven who spoke of strange lights and unsettling sounds in the woods around Blackwood Creek. While most of it was dismissed as local superstition, the detectives had a duty to consider every angle. Was it possible they had encountered someone living off the grid in the vast wilderness, someone who didn't want to be found? Patrols were sent deeper into the national forest than the initial search had gone, but they found no signs of any undeclared residents or hidden encampments. A point of contention within the investigation was the camera equipment. A state-of-the-art high-8 camera and professional microphone were expensive items in 2001. The theory of a robbery gone wrong was considered, however. This didn't align with the evidence at the scene. Sarah's wallet and Chris's watch were still in the car. If the motive was robbery, why leave behind valuable items? It didn't add up. The missing camera seemed intrinsically linked to their disappearance, not as a motive for a crime, but as a missing piece of the narrative they themselves were trying to create. After 6 months of intensive investigation, the active search for Sarah and Chris was officially suspended. The case remained open, but with no new leads to pursue, it was moved to the back burner. Detective Miller had to deliver the news to the Jenkins and Martinez families, a conversation that has haunted him ever since. Telling a parent you're scaling back the search for their missing child is the hardest thing you can ever do in this job, he says. You're not just delivering information, you're extinguishing the last embers of their hope. I saw the light go out of their eyes that day. And so, the trail went cold. The forest floor was covered with new layers of leaves. Winter snows came and went, and the memory of the search began to fade from public consciousness. The case file, filled with unanswered questions, became a symbol of the unknown. Had they fallen victim to the treacherous mine? Had they met with foul play at the hands of a stranger? Or had they simply vanished? With no bodies, no witnesses, and no confession, the truth remained just out of reach, buried deep in the silence of the Oregon woods, waiting. While the world moved on. Jessica Jenkins remained anchored in October of 2001. She was only 16 when her older sister, Sarah, disappeared, and the event cleaved her life into a definitive before and after. The before was filled with the sounds of Sarah's boisterous laughter, the smell of burnt popcorn from their late-night movie sessions, and the comforting, chaotic presence of her best friend and confidant. The after was a landscape of quiet rooms, of conversations held in hushed tones, and the ever-present, gnawing ache of a question that had no answer. Her sister's absence wasn't a void, it was a constant, heavy presence that as the years stretched on, Jessica's grief slowly, painstakingly, transformed into a quiet, unyielding resolve. She watched as the official investigation stalled and the media's attention drifted away. She saw the hope in her parents' eyes flicker and dim, replaced by a weary resignation. It was then that Jessica made a silent vow to her missing sister. She would never stop looking. She would not let Sarah and Chris become just another cold case file, gathering dust in a police department basement. She would be their voice. She would be their memory. Jessica's quest for answers began in earnest. She majored in journalism in college, a choice driven less by passion and more by a need to understand how to ask the right questions, how to dig for information, how to keep a story alive. She spent her weekends and holidays revisiting the case files, which Detective Miller, seeing her fierce determination, granted her supervised access to. She created meticulous binders, cross-referencing witness statements, timelines, and old maps of the Blackwood Creek area. Her apartment became an unofficial investigation headquarters, the walls covered in notes and photographs, a testament to a sister's unwavering love. The Martinez family, meanwhile, coped with their loss in a different way. Overwhelmed by the public nature of their tragedy, they retreated from the world, finding solace in their faith and their privacy. They supported Jessica's efforts from a distance, always willing to talk to her, always grateful for her dedication, but the pain was too immense for them to be on the front lines. "Jessica is a blessing," Maria Martinez would say in their infrequent phone calls. "She has the strength we no longer do. She fights for our Christopher as much as she fights for her Sarah." Over the next 2 decades, Jessica became a familiar face in Oak Haven. She launched a website dedicated to the case, Oak Haven's Missing, which she updated regularly with any new thoughts or old information she uncovered. She started a podcast, interviewing friends, former classmates, and even retired law enforcement officers who had been involved in the initial search. Each episode was a carefully crafted plea for information, an attempt to jog someone's memory, to find that one person who saw something, heard something, and never came forward. She breathed life back into the cold case, refusing to let the silence win. Her efforts were not without their toll. There were countless false leads and cruel hoaxes that sent her heart soaring with hope, only to have it crash back to earth. People came forward with fabricated stories, seeking attention or reward money that Jessica herself had painstakingly raised. Each dead end was a fresh wave of grief, a painful reminder of the passage of time. Yet, she persevered, fueled by a deep-seated belief that the truth was out there, tangled in the weeds of the past, waiting for someone with enough patience to unravel it. She maintained a unique and lasting relationship with Detective Miller. He saw in her the same relentless spirit he had as a young detective on the case. He became a reluctant mentor, answering her late-night calls, reviewing her theories, and offering guidance based on his years of experience. "She knew the case file better than I did," Miller admits. "She saw connections I had missed, questioned, assumptions we had made back in '01. She kept the flame of this case alive, not just for the public, but for me too. She never let me forget." On the 20th anniversary of the disappearance, Jessica organized a vigil at the entrance to the Blackwood Creek Trail. It was a cold, damp October evening, eerily similar to the night Sarah and Chris had vanished. She stood before a small crowd of community members and reporters, her voice steady despite the raw emotion of the moment. "We are not here to mourn," she said, holding a candle that flickered in the wind. "We are here to remember. We are here to say their names, Sarah Jenkins and Chris Martinez, and we are here to make a promise that we will never ever give up hope of finding the truth." Despite her tireless work, the case remained stubbornly frozen. The website, the podcast, the vigils, they kept the memory alive, but they didn't unearth any new, actionable evidence. The mystery of what happened at Blackwood Creek seemed to be a fortress, impenetrable and silent. It felt, even to the ever-hopeful Jessica, that she was running on a treadmill, expending all of her energy just to stay in the same place. No closer to the truth than she was 2 decades ago. But Jessica's relentless efforts had done something crucial. They had kept the story in the ether. Her podcast had reached people far beyond Oak Haven. Her website was a digital beacon for anyone with a connection to the case, however distant. She had created a network of watchful eyes and listening ears. And in the summer of 2023, that network would finally catch something. A single, unexpected email would land in her inbox, sent by a stranger hundreds of miles away. An email that would change everything. The email that landed in Jessica Jenkins' inbox in July of 2023 was unassuming, with the simple subject line, "Regarding your sister's case." Jessica received dozens of such emails a month, most of them well-wishes or crackpot theories. But something about this one felt different. It was from a man named Mark Peterson, a lawyer from Portland, who was handling the estate of his recently deceased uncle. The uncle's name was Alistair Finch. The name hit Jessica like a physical blow. The enigmatic film professor who had been at the center of the story from the very beginning. Professor Finch had passed away quietly from a heart attack at the age of 74. He had retired from North Cascade University over a decade ago and had lived a reclusive life ever since. His nephew, Mark, was tasked with the unenviable job of cleaning out his uncle's cluttered home. A house filled with books, academic papers, and the accumulated artifacts of a long, solitary life. While sorting through the attic buried under a pile of old university catalogs and holiday decorations, Mark found a sealed, sturdy cardboard box. It was heavy, and on the side, in Finch's distinctive, spidery handwriting, were 2 words, J&M Project. Mark, who was vaguely aware of the famous Oak Haven disappearance from his youth, made the connection immediately. Jenkins and Martinez. He remembered his uncle being deeply affected by the incident, growing more withdrawn and somber in the years that followed. He had no idea why his uncle would have kept this box, let alone hidden it away in his attic for 22 years. He searched online, found Jessica's O'Carvin's missing website, and, after a moment of hesitation, decided to write the email. He described the box and asked if it could be of any significance. Es, Seeker single quotes, as hands trembled as she read the message. A box kept by Finch. Why wouldn't he have turned this over to the police in 2001? A torrent of questions flooded her mind, a mix of exhilarating hope and a dark, creeping suspicion. She immediately called Detective Miller, her voice a breathless, urgent whisper. For the first time in years, there was a tangible object, a physical link to the past that had been hidden, a secret held by the one man who had sent Sarah and Chris on their final assignment. Detective Miller, now Captain Miller, felt a jolt of adrenaline he hadn't experienced in years. The name Alistair Finch instantly brought back the memory of the guarded, sedate professor from the initial investigation. He had always felt that Finch knew more than he let on, not necessarily about a crime, but perhaps about the students' state of mind or their specific plans for that night. He had cooperative, but there was always a wall Miller couldn't seem to break through. The existence of this hidden box felt like a posthumous confession of sorts, an admission that he had withheld something crucial. Within hours, Miller and Jessica were on the road, driving the 3 hours to Portland. The car ride was thick with a tense, anticipatory silence. Jessica stared out the window, the Oregon landscape rushing by in a green blur, her mind racing with possibilities. What was in the box? Was it just their research papers? Or was it something more? Could it be the missing tapes? The thought was almost too much to bear, a fragile hope she was afraid to fully embrace, for fear it would shatter. They arrived at Professor Finch's home, a modest, ivy-covered house on a quiet street. Mark Peterson, a kind-faced man in his 40s, greeted them at the door with a somber expression. He led them up the creaky stairs to the attic, which smelled of dust and old paper. There, in the middle of the floor, was the box. It was a standard banker's box, sealed shut with yellowed packing tape. Jessica felt a profound, almost spiritual connection to it. This box had been in the same house as Sarah and Chris's secret for over 2 decades. With Mark's permission, Miller carefully sliced open the tape with a pocket knife. The sound of the tape peeling away was deafening in the quiet attic. Jessica held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. Miller lifted the flaps. Inside, nestled among bubble wrap, were not papers or notebooks. Instead, the box was filled with a collection of black, rectangular objects. They were high-8 videotapes. On the white label of the top cassette, in Sarah's familiar, bubbly handwriting, were the words, "Echoes in the deep raw footage, tapes 1 to 5. Below the 5 primary tapes was a 6th smaller cassette. It was a mini DV tape, different format altogether. It was unlabeled, tucked away at the bottom of the box, as if it were an afterthought. No one had known Sarah and Chris to even own a mini DV camera. Why was it here? What was on it? The discovery was monumental, far exceeding anything Jessica or Miller could have hoped for. These weren't just tapes. They were a time capsule, a direct window into the final days and, possibly, the final moments of Sarah Jenkins and Chris Martinez. But the discovery also raised a chilling and immediate question that hung heavy in the dusty air of the attic. Why did Professor Finch have these tapes, and why did he hide them? If he had them all along, it meant he had knowingly obstructed the investigation for 22 years, allowing 2 families to live in a state of unending torment. The professor was no longer just a sad figure in the story. He was now a central and deeply suspicious character. The secret he took to his grave was now sitting in a cardboard box, waiting to be revealed. The drive back to Oakhaven was a world away from the journey to Portland. The box of tapes sat on the back seat, a sacred object radiating a silent, powerful energy. Jessica couldn't take her eyes off it, her mind a maelstrom of hope, fear, and anger. Anger at Professor Finch for his decades of deception, fear of what the tapes might reveal, and a fragile flickering hope that after 22 years, she might finally hear her sister's voice again. Captain Miller drove in a focused silence, his mind already spinning, planning the next steps, knowing that this discovery had just resurrected a ghost and officially reopened the coldest case of his career. Back at the Oakhaven Police Department, The tapes were handled with the utmost care, booked into evidence as Exhibit A in the reopened Jenkins-Martinez case. The news sent a ripple through the department, with younger officers looking on with curiosity as the legendary cold case suddenly came back to life. Miller knew that playing the tapes was not as simple as finding an old camera. The high 8 and mini-DV formats were obsolete. More importantly, the magnetic tapes were over 2 decades old and potentially fragile. They needed to be handled by forensic experts to ensure they could be safely played and digitized without being damaged. The department reached out to the state's forensic video lab. The tapes were carefully packaged and sent with a police escort. For Jessica, the wait was agonizing. For days, she barely slept, her phone always in her hand, waiting for the call from Miller. She sat with the Martinez family, sharing the news in person. It was a difficult, emotional meeting. The discovery of the tapes brought their long-buried grief rushing back to the surface, but it was mixed with the first glimmer of potential closure they had felt in a generation. Together, they braced themselves for what was to come. Finally, the call came. The lab had successfully digitized all 6 tapes. The quality was surprisingly good, a testament to how well Finch had stored them. Miller arranged for a private viewing at the station, just for himself, Jessica, and the Martinez family. He wanted them to see it first, before it became official. Evidence to be picked apart by a room full of detectives. Walking into that viewing room felt surreal. On a large monitor, a technician hit play, and the screen flickered from blue to static. And then, an image resolved. It was Sarah. She was 20 years old again, her face framed by the camera, squinting. In the bright autumn sun, she was talking to Chris, who was clearly holding the camera. "Okay, rolling," she asks, her voice clear and vibrant, a sound Jessica had only heard in her memories for 22 years. Jessica let out a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief and pain. Maria Martinez reached out and squeezed her hand, tears streaming down her own face. For the first time, they were not looking at a faded photograph, but at a living, breathing memory. The first 5 tapes contained the raw footage for their documentary, Echoes in the Deep. It was exactly as they had described in their proposal. There were long, sweeping shots of the desolate Blackwood Creek landscape, interviews with the local historian, and close-ups of decaying structures. More importantly, there were candid moments between Sarah and Chris. They were seen laughing, debating camera angles, and complaining about the cold. It was an intimate, heartbreaking portrait of 2 young, vibrant people deeply engrossed in their passion, completely unaware of the fate that lay ahead. The tapes were a timeline in themselves. Tape 1 showed their initial daytime explorations. Tapes 2 and 3 were filled with their library research and the interview. Tape 4 showed them making a second trip, this time on a gray, overcast day, adding a more somber mood to their footage. They were clearly building a narrative, piecing together their story. Captain Miller watched with a detective's eye, scanning every frame for anything out of the ordinary. Any background detail that might have been missed in 2001. Tape 5 was different. The label simply said Night Shoot, October 12th. This was it. The footage from the night they disappeared. The tape began with a shot of the sunset from the trail leading to the mine. Then, darkness. The screen was illuminated only by the powerful beam of a camera-mounted light. Sarah can be heard narrating in a hushed, dramatic whisper, describing the eerie sounds of the forest. Chris, ever the artist, captured haunting images of moonlight filtering through the trees and the ominous fenced-off entrance to the mine. As they watched the footage from that night, the mood in the viewing room grew heavy with dread. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the audio track felt like a premonition. The footage showed them approaching the compromised section of the fence. "Think we should?" Chris asks, his voice hesitant. "We have to," Sarah replies, her voice full of determination. "The best shots are on the other side." The camera is then set down on the ground, pointing up at the night sky, and for a few minutes, only their muffled voices can be heard as they apparently squeeze through the fence. The 5th tape ended there. The footage cut out abruptly after they seemingly entered the restricted area around the mine entrance. It offered no clue as to what happened next. The sense of hope in the room deflated, replaced by the familiar frustration of a dead end. There was still one more tape. The small, unlabeled mini-DV cassette. The technician swapped it in. No one knew what to expect. What was on this mysterious final tape, and why was it in a different format? The answer: they prayed, would be the key. The blue screen on the monitor flickered, giving way to the contents of the final, mysterious mini-DV tape. The footage was immediately different. It wasn't the steady, artistic camera work of Chris Martinez. The image was shaky, frantic, and clearly filmed by someone in a state of panic. The audio was distorted by the sound of heavy breathing and the crunch of running footsteps on dry leaves and gravel. It was night, and the only light source was a weak, bouncing flashlight beam that cut haphazardly through the oppressive darkness of the Blackwood Creek woods. The first comprehensible image was a fleeting, terrifying glimpse of the mine's entrance. The danger sign was briefly illuminated, looking stark and ominous in the shaky light. The camera then whipped around, as if the person holding it was looking back over their shoulder. For a heart-stopping second, two figures were visible in the distance, silhouetted against the faint glow of what must have been their own camera light near the fence line. It was unmistakably Sarah and Chris, just moments after they had slipped through the fence. This footage was not shot by them. It was shot of them. Jessica and the Martinez family leaned forward, their knuckles white as they gripped the arms of their chairs. Captain Miller felt a chill run down his spine. For 22 years, everyone had assumed Sarah and Chris were alone that night. This tape was irrefutable proof that they were wrong. Someone else was there, hidden in the woods, watching them. The camera operator was clearly trying to remain concealed, hiding behind trees, the sound of their own ragged breathing the only narration to the horrifying scene unfolding. The footage continued for another agonizing 90 seconds. The hidden observer filmed as Sarah and Chris approached the gaping maw of the main tunnel. They seemed unaware they were being watched, their attention focused on setting up their shot. Sarah could be seen directing Chris, pointing towards the tunnel. Then, a new sound emerged on the tape, faint at first, but growing closer. It was the low, rumbling engine of an older vehicle, its headlights cutting through the trees as it slowly made its way up the dirt access road toward the mine. The person holding the mini-DV camera immediately panicked. The camera dropped lower, pointing towards the ground, but it kept recording. The footsteps of the observer were now hasty, retreating deeper into the woods, away from the approaching vehicle. The vehicle, a large dark-colored truck from the brief glimpse seen through the trees, pulled to a stop just out of frame. A car door slammed shut. Muffled voices could be heard, too indistinct to make out what was being said, but the tone was confrontational. What happened next was a chaotic blur of sound and fragmented images. The camera, still recording from its low angle, captured the sounds of a heated argument. A man's voice, deep and angry, was clearly audible, shouting, "You're not supposed to be here." Another voice, younger, likely Chris, could be heard trying to explain, "We're just students, it's for a project." Then, the unmistakable sound of a physical altercation, a grunt, a thud, and a woman's scream, quickly muffled. It was Sarah. Jessica screamed in the viewing room, a raw, primal cry of absolute terror. The person filming began to run, their panic palpable. The flashlight beam created a dizzying, strobe-like effect on the forest floor as they crashed through the underbrush. They were clearly terrified, fleeing the scene of the violence. After about 30 seconds of this frantic retreat, the person tripped and fell. The camera tumbled from their grasp, landing in a pile of leaves, its lens pointing up at the canopy of black skeletal branches against the night sky. The audio continued for another minute, capturing the sound of the person scrambling to their feet and running away until their footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only the chilling ambient sound of the woods at night. And then, the tape ended. Silence descended upon the viewing room, thick and suffocating. The reflection on the dark screen showed four faces, pale and stricken with horror. They had just witnessed the abduction of Sarah Jenkins and Chris Martinez. It wasn't an accident in the mine. It wasn't a case of getting lost. It was a violent, deliberate act, perpetrated by at least one person who had arrived in that truck, and it had all been captured on this tape. A tape filmed by a secret witness who had been there, saw everything, and then fled. Captain Miller's mind was racing, processing the new, horrific reality of the case. He had suspects, he had a crime scene, but he also had a new, critical unknown, the identity of the person who filmed this tape. Why did they have a mini-DV camera? Why were they secretly filming Sarah and Chris? And most importantly, why did they run? Why did they never come forward to the police with this bombshell evidence? This eyewitness was not just a witness. They were a central figure in the mystery. And then there was the question of the tape itself. How did this mini DV cassette, filmed by a terrified, fleeing witness, end up in a box with Sarah and Chris's own high 8 tapes, hidden in Professor Finch's attic for 22 years? The professor's role in this had just become infinitely more complex and sinister. The footage was a key, but it unlocked a room filled with even more questions. The most pressing of which was identifying the angry voice from the tape, and the unseen observer who had held the truth in their hands all along. The revelation from the mini DV tape sent the investigation into overdrive. The Oakhaven Police Department, in collaboration with state and federal agencies, assembled a full task force. The grainy, terrifying footage became the singular focus of their efforts. Audio forensic specialists were brought in to isolate and enhance the voices from the tape. The angry, deep voice shouting, "You're not supposed to be here," was digitized, and technicians worked tirelessly to clean it up, hoping to create a voice print that could be matched against records. The sounds of the old truck's engine were also analyzed, trying to determine a possible make and model. The most urgent task, however, was identifying the third person, the terrified filmmaker. Captain Miller and his team went back to the beginning, re-examining every single piece of information from 2001 through a new lens. Who else was in Sarah and Chris's circle? Who else knew they were going to the mine that night? They started with the class roster for advanced documentary filmmaking. There were 12 students in that class. Each one had been briefly interviewed in 2001, but now they would be re-interviewed as potential witnesses or even suspects. Jessica Jenkins, though reeling from the horror of the tape, threw herself into the new investigation with renewed purpose. Her intimate knowledge of Sarah's life was invaluable. She combed through her sister's old yearbooks, photo albums, and journals, which she had preserved with meticulous care. She was looking for a face, a name, anyone who was close to Sarah and Chris but might have been overlooked. Was there a jealous friend, a secret rival, someone who might have followed them that night? The connection to Professor Finch and the tapes was the most perplexing puzzle. The task force developed 2 primary theories. The first was that the terrified witness, for some reason, went to Finch after the incident, gave him the tape, and swore him to secrecy. Perhaps they feared the perpetrator or were afraid of being implicated themselves. The second, more sinister theory was that Finch himself was the third person, but that didn't fit. The person filming was clearly in a panic, running for their life. It didn't seem like the actions of a composed, older professor. The timeline didn't quite add up. The investigation led them to a former student from the film class named Leo Guthrie. In 2001, Leo was known as a talented but troubled student, fiercely competitive and often at odds with his peers. Classmates recalled a palpable rivalry between Leo and the Sarah-Chris duo. While they were praised for their ambitious project, Leo's proposal for a similar investigative documentary had been rejected by Finch as unfocused. Several students remembered Leo making bitter comments, feeling that Finch unfairly favored Sarah and Chris. Detectives tracked Leo Guthrie down. He was now living a quiet life in Seattle, working as a freelance graphic designer. When 2 detectives showed up at his apartment, he was visibly shaken. At first, he denied having any significant interactions with Sarah and Chris outside of class. But when they pressed him about his feelings of rivalry, about Professor Finch, his composure began to crack. He nervously ran his hands through his thinning hair, his eyes darting around the room. Avoiding their direct gaze, Miller decided to bring Leo back to Oakhaven for a formal interview. In the sterile environment of an interrogation room, Miller played a short audio-only clip from the beginning of the mini DV tape, the sound of the heavy breathing and the crunch of footsteps. He watched Leo's reaction closely. Leo's face went pale, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. He recognized the sound. It was the sound of his own terror, a sound he had been running from for 22 years. His silence crumbled, and the story he had buried for more than 2 decades finally came pouring out. Leo confessed. He was the one who filmed the tape. Consumed by professional jealousy and convinced that Sarah and Chris were getting undeserved praise, he had followed them to Blackwood Creek that night. He wanted to see what they were doing, perhaps even to sabotage their shoot or steal their ideas. He had recently bought a new mini DV camera and brought it along, hiding in the woods, secretly filming them like a spy. He was the unseen observer, the third person at the scene. His story then turned from pathetic jealousy to abject terror. He recounted seeing the old truck arrive, hearing the argument, and witnessing the brutal attack. He was paralyzed by fear. He thought the man in the truck had seen him. In a blind panic, he ran, dropping his brand new camera in his haste to escape. He never looked back. He was so terrified of being found by either the attacker or the police that he never retrieved his camera. He just ran and never stopped running. But Leo's confession created a critical new question. If he dropped the camera in the woods and fled, how did it end up in Professor Finch's attic? Leo swore he never spoke to Finch about that night. He dropped out of the class the following week, citing personal reasons, and tried to erase the entire memory from his life. So who found the camera? Who picked it up from the forest floor, and why did they take it, and its horrifying contents? Not to the police, but to Alistair Finch. The mystery of the third person was solved, but it only deepened the mystery of the fourth. Leo Guthrie's confession provided a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it also pointed to another missing link. There was a fourth person involved, not at the crime itself, but in its immediate aftermath. Someone found Leo's camera in the woods. This person watched the terrifying footage, understood its importance, and for reasons unknown, made the fateful decision to deliver it to Professor Alistair Finch. The task force's attention now pivoted to this new mystery. They had to figure out who else had a connection to the Blackwood Creek mine. Captain Miller's team began digging into the history of the land itself. The mine and the surrounding property were owned by a large timber corporation based out of state, but they employed a local caretaker to watch over the land, to ensure hikers didn't wander into the dangerous areas, and to report any trespassing or vandalism. For nearly 30 years, from the late 1980s until his retirement in 2015, that caretaker was a man named Frank Coleman, a quiet, solitary man who lived in a small cabin just a few miles from the mine entrance. Frank Coleman's name had appeared in the original 2001 case file, but only briefly. He had been interviewed by a patrol officer in the days following the disappearance. He claimed he hadn't been near the mine on the night of October 12th and had seen nothing unusual. He was a man who kept to himself, and with no evidence to the contrary, he was quickly dismissed as a person of interest. Now, with the new evidence, Miller realized this was a critical oversight. If anyone was likely to find a camera dropped in those woods, it was the man who walked them every day. Detectives found Frank Coleman living in a small retirement community in a neighboring town. He was in his late 70s, frail and suffering from emphysema, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When they first questioned him about the 2001 disappearance, he gave the same story he had told 2 decades earlier, his eyes betraying nothing. But when they told him about the mini DV camera, about the secret witness, and about the tapes being found in Professor Finch's house, a flicker of recognition, of profound weariness, crossed his face. After a long, strained silence, punctuated by the hiss of his oxygen tank, Frank began to talk. His voice was raspy, filled with the guilt he had carried for 22 years. He confessed that he had lied to the police in 2001. He had, in fact, been making his rounds near the mine on the morning of October 13th, when he found Sarah and Chris's abandoned station wagon. Before the police had even been alerted, he went for a walk in the woods, looking for the trespassers. It was then that he stumbled upon the small, black camera lying in a pile of leaves. He took the camera back to his cabin. Being a curious man, he figured out how to play the tape back. He watched, horrified, as the events of the previous night unfolded before his eyes. He saw the 2 students, the arrival of the truck, and the brutal abduction. He also heard the voice of the attacker, a voice he recognized instantly. It was his own nephew, a troubled man named Wyatt, who sometimes used the old access roads to illegally hunt and cut firewood on the property. Frank knew his nephew had a violent temper and an old beat-up truck that matched the one on the tape. Frank was thrown into a moral crisis. He was holding evidence that implicated his own family. He knew he should go to the police, but the thought of sending his sister's only son to prison for life, or worse, was unbearable. He also feared Wyatt. His nephew was a volatile and dangerous man, so Frank made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He couldn't go to the police, but he couldn't just throw the tape away either. He knew the 2 students were from the university, and he remembered hearing them talk about their film professor. In a desperate, misguided attempt to do something, He looked up Professor Finch's address and anonymously left the camera on his doorstep. His confession explained everything. It explained how the tape got from the forest floor to Finch's house. Frank had hoped the professor, an educated man, would know what to do, that he would get the tape to the authorities without implicating Frank. He never knew what Finch had ultimately done with it. He just knew he couldn't carry the burden himself. He had lived every day since with the crushing weight of his silence, a silence born from a misguided sense of family loyalty and fear. The focus of the investigation now had a name and a face: Wyatt Coleman. The task force immediately began building a case against him. They discovered that Wyatt had a long and violent criminal record, with multiple arrests for assault and battery. In the years before and after 2001, he was a man who lived on the fringes, known for his explosive temper and his deep resentment of outsiders. In 2001, he was living in Oakhaven, unemployed, and frequently clashing with his uncle Frank about his activities on the timber company's land. But there was one final, tragic twist. As detectives prepared an arrest warrant and organized a surveillance team, they ran Wyatt Coleman's name through the national database. They discovered that Wyatt had died 4 years prior, in 2019, in a bar fight in another state. The perpetrator, the man whose angry voice was captured on that tape, was dead. There would be no trial, no conviction, no day in court for Sarah and Chris. The one man who held the final answers had taken them to his grave. The news that the prime suspect, Wyatt Coleman, was dead was a devastating blow to everyone involved. For Jessica and the Martinez family, it was the ultimate frustration. After 22 years of searching for a ghost, they had finally found him, only to discover that he had become one himself. There would be no confrontation, no justice in a courtroom, no chance to look the man who had stolen their loved ones in the eye and ask him the one question that still remained: why? The sense of anticlimax was profound, a hollow ache where catharsis was supposed to be. Despite Wyatt's death, Captain Miller and the task force were determined to close the case definitively. They needed to prove, beyond any doubt, that Wyatt was the man on the tape, and more importantly, they needed to find Sarah and Chris. Using Frank Coleman's testimony, they focused their attention on a remote, abandoned quarry on the far side of the timber company's property, a place Wyatt was known to frequent. Frank reluctantly admitted that Wyatt had often talked about the old quarry as a place where you could make things disappear. A massive-scale excavation was organized at the quarry. It was a grim and arduous task. Forensic anthropologists and archaeological teams were brought in to systematically search the area. They used ground-penetrating radar to look for anomalies beneath the earth. For days, the search yielded nothing but rock and dirt. The hope that had been so painstakingly rebuilt began to feel fragile once more. Jessica and the Martinez family kept a vigil nearby, waiting under the gray Oregon sky, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and dread. Then, on the 4th day of the search, a piece of rusted metal was unearthed. It was the buckle of a belt. Soon after, more items began to surface: the remnants of a leather boot, scraps of denim fabric, and finally, human bones. The remains of 2 individuals were carefully excavated from a shallow, unmarked grave. In the earth beside them, tangled in the dirt, was a badly corroded but still recognizable object: the lens of a Hi-8 camera. They had found them. After 22 years, Sarah and Chris were finally coming home. The DNA analysis confirmed the identities of the remains. The Oakhaven community mourned collectively as the news broke. The mystery that had haunted the town for a generation was finally solved, but the resolution brought no joy. It was a tragedy laid bare, a confirmation of the worst fears that everyone had harbored for 2 long decades. The story of Sarah Jenkins and Chris Martinez was no longer a mystery. It was a heartbreaking account of 2 young lives cut short by a senseless act of violence. With the recovery of the bodies, the full picture of that night in 2001 came into focus. Wyatt Coleman, likely agitated at finding trespassers on what he considered his territory, confronted Sarah and Chris. The argument, captured on Leo Guthrie's tape, escalated into a violent assault. Wyatt murdered them both at the mine site, and then, under the cover of darkness, drove their bodies to the abandoned quarry and buried them, along with their camera, in a desperate attempt to hide his crime. He had almost succeeded. The roles of the other men in the story were also brought to light. Leo Guthrie, the jealous classmate, received a sentence of probation and community service for his initial concealment of the event. His testimony having been crucial to solving the case, Frank Coleman, the tormented caretaker, faced no legal charges due to his age, failing health, and his eventual cooperation. But he would live out his remaining days with the knowledge that his silence had cost two families 22 years of agonizing uncertainty. And Professor Alistair Finch, the reclusive academic, remained an enigma. He had watched the tape, understood its implications, but chose to hide it, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps from a misguided and paralyzing academic detachment. His secret, a profound moral failure, was a burden he carried to his grave. A funeral service was held for Sarah Jenkins and Chris Martinez. They were buried side by side in the Oakhaven Cemetery, their joint headstone overlooking the town they had once called home. The service was attended by hundreds, a testament to the community that had never forgotten them. Jessica Jenkins stood before the crowd, not with the fire of an investigator, but with the quiet sorrow of a sister finally able to say goodbye. She spoke of Sarah's light, her laughter, and her fearless spirit. The Martinez family spoke of Chris's gentle soul, his kindness, and his artistic eye. The class project, Echoes in the Deep, was never finished, but in a way, it had achieved its goal. The digitized footage, both their work and the horrifying final tape, was compiled by the university's film department, not as a documentary, but as a memorial. It was a testament to their passion and a chilling record of their final days. It served as a powerful reminder that behind every cold case, there are real people with dreams, ambitions, and families who love them. The silence at Blackwood Creek is different now. It is no longer a silence of mystery, but one of memory. The truth, which Sarah Jenkins so desperately wanted to unearth, was finally brought to light, not by her own camera, but by the echoes of her actions that rippled through time. The case of the vanished college friends is now closed, but for those who loved them, the loss remains. It is a quiet space in their lives, a chapter that is finally complete, but one whose tragic words will never be erased.